Imagine the scene. The Apostle Paul, a prisoner under Roman custody, is about to embark on a perilous journey across the sea. His destination? Rome. But this isn't just any ordinary voyage. This journey is filled with danger, uncertainty, and divine intervention. Paul had long desired to go to Rome, but not as a prisoner in chains. However, God had a plan far greater than anyone could see at that moment. He was to stand before Caesar and testify about Christ. But first he had to endure a treacherous sea voyage, one that would test not only his faith, but the very lives of those traveling with him. The ship, a sturdy Alexandrian vessel, was filled with soldiers, sailors, and fellow prisoners. Among them was Luke, the writer of Acts, and Aristarchus, a devoted companion of Paul. As the ship left the shores of Caesarea, the journey seemed peaceful at first. But seasoned sailors knew that the Mediterranean was unpredictable, especially during this time of year. The looming threat of violent storms was real, and the further they sailed, the greater the risks became. Paul, despite being a prisoner, was not just another captive on board. He carried the wisdom of God, the experience of past hardships, and the unwavering faith that no matter what happened, he was in the hands of the Almighty. Yet, the crew and soldiers around him did not yet understand the divine purpose behind his presence. The voyage progressed, and soon difficulties arose. The winds were against them, slowing their progress and making navigation difficult. Every sailor on board knew what this meant. Trouble was brewing. Despite their best efforts to stay on course, they were being pushed off track. Days turned into weeks, and exhaustion began to take its toll. But Paul could sense something even greater ahead, something beyond just the challenges of sailing. God was leading him into a storm, but this storm was not meant for his destruction. It was meant for his testimony. The journey was not just about reaching Rome. It was about revealing God's power in the midst of chaos. As the ship pressed forward, the tension on board grew. The crew knew they were heading into dangerous waters, but they believed their skills and experience would be enough to get them through. Paul, however, saw things differently. He could feel the weight of something divine about to unfold, and so the stage was set. The apostle, the soldiers, the sailors, and the raging sea, each playing their part in a story that would demonstrate one of the most powerful examples of faith and trust in God amidst the storms of life. Little did they know, their voyage was about to take a dramatic and life-threatening turn. As the ship continued its journey, the winds became increasingly hostile. The vessel, already struggling against the elements, was making slow progress. The sailors and soldiers on board were growing frustrated. Time was slipping away, and their route was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. They had reached a place called Fair Havens, a harbor on the island of Crete, but the conditions were far from ideal. Winter was approaching, and every experienced seafarer knew that the Mediterranean was no place to be caught in the stormy season. It was at this moment that Paul, despite being a prisoner, felt compelled to speak. He was no sailor, but he was a man of God, one who had faced shipwreck before, endured suffering, and learned to listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit. Standing before the crew, the Roman soldiers, and the ship's owner, he issued a solemn warning. "Men, I perceive that this voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss, not only to the ship and cargo, but also to our lives." It was a simple warning, but it carried a weight of urgency. Paul was not speaking from human wisdom, he was speaking from divine insight. Yet the question was, would they listen? The decision was left in the hands of the ship's owner, the captain, and Julius, the centurion in charge of the prisoners. And despite Paul's warning, they chose to ignore him. The reasoning was simple. Fair Havens was not a suitable place to spend the winter. It was too exposed, too inconvenient. If they could just press on a little further to a better harbor called Phoenix, they would have a much safer and more comfortable stay. Julius, the Roman centurion, trusted the judgment of the captain and the ship's owner over the words of a prisoner. And so the decision was made. They would set sail once again, hoping to reach Phoenix before the storms trapped them. For a brief moment, everything seemed to be working in their favor. A gentle south wind began to blow, making it look like they had made the right choice. Encouraged by this favorable shift, They raised the anchor and set sail, convinced that they were in control of their fate. But they were wrong. Within hours, their optimism turned into sheer terror. The wind that had seemed so promising suddenly transformed into a violent hurricane-force storm. A tempest known as a northeaster swept down upon them with devastating fury. The ship was no longer in their control. It was being driven by the storm, tossed violently by the raging sea. In that moment, the reality of Paul's warning became painfully clear. They had ignored the voice of God's servant, trusting in their own understanding instead. And now, they were at the mercy of a storm that no human effort could withstand. The once confident sailors began to panic. The Roman soldiers, usually unshaken by battle, were now gripped by fear. The ship groaned under the relentless force of the winds and waves. This was no ordinary storm. This was a storm that would push them to the very limits of survival. And in the chaos, one question remained. Would they finally listen to the man they had ignored? The moment the ship left the safety of fair havens, it became clear that Paul's warning had not been the superstitious fear of a prisoner. It had been a divine insight into what was coming. The gentle south wind that had given them hope quickly vanished. In its place came a monstrous force of nature, an uncontrollable storm known as a northeaster, a violent, hurricane-strength wind that swept down from the island with merciless power. The crew barely had time to react before the ship was caught in the tempest. The sails flapped wildly, ropes snapped under the strain, and the towering waves crashed against the sides of the vessel with deafening force. The ship was no longer being navigated. It was being driven. The men on board were no longer in control of their destiny. They were at the mercy of the storm. Panic spread among the sailors. Orders were shouted, but they were barely heard over the howling wind. The waves grew taller, threatening to consume them. With each passing moment, the ship was tossed like a toy in the hands of a raging sea. The seasoned sailors knew the danger. This was no ordinary storm. If they didn't act fast, the ship would be torn apart. Desperate to survive, they made their first move. They fought to steer the ship to the island of Cauda, a small body of land where they might find some shelter. It was their only hope of stabilizing the vessel. With immense effort, they managed to hoist the lifeboat aboard, a task that should have been simple, but under these conditions it was nearly impossible. The lifeboat had been trailing behind, but if they lost it now, there would be no escape if the ship went down. Then came another desperate measure, undergirding the ship. The sailors wrapped ropes around the hull, trying to hold it together against the onslaught of the waves. It was a technique known as frapping, used in emergencies to reinforce the structure of a ship, but it was no guarantee of survival. Yet, even with these efforts, the storm showed no mercy. The wind continued to drive them uncontrollably into the open sea. Fearing that they would be thrown into the sandbanks of Syrtis, a notorious graveyard for ships, they made the heart-wrenching decision to throw some of the cargo overboard. The very goods they had set out to transport, the very purpose of their journey, were now being sacrificed in a desperate bid to stay afloat. But the storm did not let up. The next day they took even more drastic action. The crew, their faces lined with exhaustion and terror, began to throw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. These were not unnecessary luxuries. They were essential tools for navigation. And yet they had no choice. Survival was the only priority. By the third day, despair had settled upon the entire crew. The sky had turned black. The sun and stars, their only means of navigation, had vanished behind the thick, unrelenting clouds. It was as if the heavens had closed in on them, sealing their fate. For days they battled the storm, their strength waning, their hope fading. They had done all they could. Every strategy, every skill they had learned from years at sea had been exhausted. Yet the storm continued to rage. It was relentless, unforgiving. And then came the breaking point. Luke, who was aboard the ship, later wrote, "We finally gave up all hope of being saved. It was a moment of utter defeat. The sailors, the soldiers, even the hardened criminals aboard, all had surrendered to the inevitable. Death seemed certain. They were lost at sea, without direction, without control, without hope. But little did they know, hope was still on board. Hope had not been thrown into the sea with the cargo. Hope had not been lost in the darkness of the storm. Because Paul, the prisoner they had ignored, still had a message to deliver, one that would change everything. The ship was no longer a vessel of men, it was a prison of fear. Days had passed with no glimpse of the sun or stars, no sense of direction, no control over their fate. The storm had robbed them of everything, their strength, their confidence, their hope. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, exhaustion clouded their minds, and the overwhelming certainty of death had settled in their hearts. No one spoke of survival anymore. The men sat in silence, drenched, trembling, waiting for the inevitable. And then, in the middle of the despair, a voice rose above the howling winds. Paul stood before them, not as a prisoner, not as a helpless victim of the storm, but as a man carrying a message that could change everything. His presence was not one of fear, but of conviction. He looked at the sailors, the soldiers, the passengers, and he spoke with an authority that was impossible to ignore. Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. It was not a statement of arrogance, not a told you so, but a sobering reminder that God had given them a chance to avoid this. But then, before the weight of regret could settle in, Paul continued, his voice steady, unwavering. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. The men blinked in disbelief. How could he speak of survival when everything pointed to disaster? What did he know that they didn't? And then Paul revealed the source of his confidence. Last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." An angel, a divine messenger, had come to him in the dead of night, not to warn of doom, but to promise life. Paul's eyes burned with conviction as he declared, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." It was an incredible statement, one that demanded faith in the unseen, trust in a promise that seemed impossible. The storm had not weakened, the waves had not calmed. The ship was still at the mercy of the wind, but Paul was certain. He did not need to see the outcome to believe in it. For the first time in days, a flicker of hope ignited in the eyes of the men. Could it be true? Could they survive this nightmare? The idea seemed insane. And yet, there was something about Paul, something about the way he spoke, the way he carried himself, the unshakable confidence in his voice, that made them want to believe. And so they listened. In that moment, the ship was no longer just a place of despair. It had become a battleground between fear and faith, between the raging storm and the quiet certainty of God's promise. And Paul, once seen as just another prisoner, had become the beacon of hope they so desperately needed. But the trial was not over yet. The storm was still raging, the night was still dark, and though they now had a promise of survival, the greatest tests were still to come. The storm had not relented. The waves still crashed against the ship, threatening to tear it apart at any moment. The men were exhausted beyond words, their bodies weak from hunger, their minds clouded by sleepless nights and relentless fear. They had reached the edge of human endurance. Every instinct screamed at them to do something, anything, to take control, to survive. But Paul's words echoed in their minds. "Keep up your courage, for I have faith in God that it will happen, just as he told me." Still, faith was difficult to hold on to when the storm showed no signs of stopping. And that's when desperation took hold. Some of the sailors, men who had spent their lives navigating treacherous waters, began to whisper among themselves. They had a plan, a way to escape the doomed vessel. The lifeboat, their last hope, was still attached to the ship. If they could lower it quietly, slip away under the cover of darkness, they might have a chance at survival. The ship was lost, Paul had said as much, but they didn't have to go down with it. Slowly they moved, their hands working swiftly yet silently, untying the ropes that held the lifeboat in place. They tried to appear as if they were simply securing the ship's anchors, not drawing suspicion from the others. Their hearts pounded with both fear and anticipation. They were moments away from freedom. But Paul saw them, and more than that, he understood what they were doing. He turned immediately to the Roman centurion Julius and the soldiers standing guard. His voice was firm, urgent. "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." The words cut through the chaos like lightning. The soldiers exchanged glances. Paul had been right before, about the storm, about their survival. Could he be right about this too? They didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, the soldiers drew their swords and rushed to the lifeboat. With powerful strokes, they severed the ropes, sending the small boat plunging into the raging sea below. It was gone. The sailors' last chance at escape had vanished before their eyes, and now there was no choice left. They were in this together. Sink or survive. Paul's statement had been more than just a warning. It was a test of trust. Could they let go of their own instincts, their own desperate plans, and fully place their faith in the promise of God? In that moment, everything changed. The men who had once been divided, soldiers, sailors, prisoners, were now bound together by one thing, the certainty that their only hope was in the unseen, in the words of a man who spoke with divine conviction. And as the night stretched on, as the storm continued its relentless assault, they began to realize something incredible. Paul was not just a prisoner of Rome, he was a messenger of God. And perhaps, just perhaps, if they followed his words, they might actually make it through the storm alive. The hours dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The ship groaned and creaked under the relentless force of the storm, its wooden frame barely holding together. The men aboard were beyond exhausted. Hunger gnawed at their insides. Their limbs were weak, and their minds fogged by the unending chaos. The storm had stripped them of everything: comfort, security, hope. For 14 days they had battled the raging sea, their bodies battered by the violent tossing of the ship, their souls tormented by the uncertainty of survival. They had lost all sense of time. Morning and night blurred together in an endless cycle of fear. The cold seeped into their bones. The hunger was unbearable. The last scraps of food had been rationed days ago, but no one had the strength to care anymore. And then the moment came. The moment when despair threatened to consume them entirely. Through the howling wind and crashing waves, a whisper of realization settled over the crew. This was it. There was no escaping the inevitable. They were going to die. The sea, merciless and untamed, would claim them just as it had claimed countless others before. Silence fell over the ship, not the silence of peace, but of surrender. Even the most hardened sailors, men who had spent their lives braving the fiercest waters, sat in resignation. What more could they do? They had fought, they had struggled, and still the storm had won. But then, amidst the despair, Paul stood, with a strength that defied the storm. He raised his voice above the chaos. "Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete, but take courage. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." His words cut through the hopelessness like a beacon of light. The men turned to him, their eyes hollow, searching for anything, any reason to believe. Paul continued, his conviction unwavering. "Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you.'" The revelation hung in the air, almost unbelievable. But Paul pressed on, driving the truth into their weary hearts. "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." It was more than just words, it was a lifeline. The men, starving and hopeless just moments before, began to stir. Something deep inside them, something buried beneath layers of fear and exhaustion, awakened. It wasn't just Paul's confidence, it was the certainty in his voice, the unshakable trust he had in what he had been told. Could it be true? Could they actually survive this? For the first time in days, a flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. And then Paul did something unexpected. He reached for what little food remained, lifted it in his hands, and gave thanks to God in front of them all. It was an act so simple yet so profound. The storm raged on, the waves still crashed, but at that moment, something changed. Paul ate, and one by one the others followed. Their bodies weak, their spirits nearly crushed. But for the first time in 2 weeks they ate. It wasn't just food, it was faith. Faith that the words Paul spoke were true. Faith that against all odds they would make it through the night. Faith that even when all hope seemed lost, there was still a reason to hold on. The breaking point had come, but instead of breaking them, it had revealed something greater. A chance to trust, a chance to believe, and soon, a chance to be saved. The 14th night had arrived, and with it the realization that they were being carried toward an unknown shore. The winds, though still fierce, seemed to shift slightly, and the crashing of waves against unseen rocks signaled that land was near. The men, weary beyond words, strained their eyes in the darkness, searching for any sign of hope. Then, just past midnight, the sailors sensed it, a change in the depth beneath them. Instinctively, they threw out the first sounding line. It sank, measured and returned, 20 fathoms. They were getting closer, but how close? A second sounding confirmed their worst fear. 15 fathoms. The ocean floor was rising fast beneath them. Panic spread through the ship like wildfire. They had survived the storm, but now they faced an entirely new terror, being shattered against unseen rocks before the morning came. Desperation took hold. Some of the sailors, gripping at any hope of survival, devised a plan. Under the guise of lowering anchors from the bow, they instead prepared to abandon ship, secretly untying the lifeboat. Their loyalty ended where their fear began. But Paul saw through them. He turned to the centurion and the soldiers, his voice cutting through the darkness. "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." The order was swift. The soldiers rushed forward and without hesitation cut the ropes that held the lifeboat. It crashed into the raging sea, swallowed instantly by the black waters. There would be no escape. No one would survive this on their own. They would live or die together. The tension was unbearable. The minutes crawled by, each one edged with uncertainty. But Paul stood among them, steady, unwavering. He knew what must come next. With dawn approaching, he took the last of the bread, lifted it in his hands, and gave thanks to God in front of them all. The simple act, the quiet prayer, carried more weight than any command. One by one, the men followed his lead, eating for the first time in days. Strength returned to their bodies, if only slightly, and with it something even more precious: courage. And then, as the first golden streaks of light broke across the horizon, they saw it. Land. Small bay, an opening in the coastline. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The ship could be driven toward it. Orders were shouted. Actions became frantic. The 4 anchors, which had been their only grip against the violent sea, were cut loose. The rudders, secured for days, were unfastened. The men hoisted what remained of the sail to catch the wind, aiming the battered vessel toward the shore. For a brief moment, hope surged. They were going to make it. But then, the impact. The front of the ship struck a sandbar, lodged firmly into place. The stern, still caught in the relentless pull of the waves, began to break apart. Wood splintered. The groan of the ship became a deafening crack. Water rushed in. Panic returned in full force. The soldiers, realizing the prisoners might escape, reached for their swords. The Roman law was clear. If a prisoner fled, his guard paid the price with his own life. The logical choice was to execute them all before they had the chance. But in that critical moment, the centurion perhaps moved. By Paul's faith, perhaps seeing the bigger picture, made a bold decision. "No one is to be harmed," he ordered. "Everyone overboard. Those who can swim go first, the rest grab onto planks and debris." And so, one by one, they leapt into the sea. The cold was shocking. The waves pulled and fought against them, but the land was near. Broken pieces of the ship became lifelines, keeping the weaker ones afloat. Some struggled, others pushed forward with all their strength. The chaos of the wreck gave way to a single desperate goal: reaching the shore. And then finally, after 14 days of terror, after being tossed and torn by the storm, after watching their ship break beneath them, they felt the sand beneath their hands. They had survived. The cold bit at their skin as the survivors pulled themselves onto the rocky shore. The storm, which had raged for 2 relentless weeks, now howled behind them, its fury spent. Waves crashed against the wreckage of the ship, breaking it further apart. But the men who had once clung to its battered hull were now sprawled across the sand, gasping for breath. For a long moment there was only exhaustion, raw, unfiltered exhaustion. Then came the realization. They were alive. Against all odds, every single one of them had made it to shore. The ship was lost, their belongings scattered across the seabed, but life remained. It was a miracle, undeniable and absolute. But where were they? Paul pushed himself up, scanning the unfamiliar land. The island was rugged, its rocky coast giving way to dense woods beyond. They had no way of knowing where they had landed, whether it was friend or foe that awaited them beyond the tree line. But as the cold set into their bones, one thing was clear. They had to find warmth, then movement. From the shadows of the trees, figures emerged, dark against the misty morning light. The survivors tensed. Roman soldiers reached for their weapons, ready for another battle. But there was no hostility in these figures, no drawn swords or raised spears. Instead, there was curiosity, and then kindness. The islanders, who would later be known as the people of Malta, approached with gifts of mercy. Seeing the shipwrecked men wet and shivering, they acted with unexpected compassion. They gathered firewood, lit flames, and welcomed the strangers to their land. The warmth of the fire cut through the numbing cold, and for the first time in weeks, Paul and the others felt a semblance of comfort. Paul, always willing to serve, joined in gathering wood to feed the fire. His hands were stiff from the cold, but he worked alongside the islanders, strengthening the flames. And then, as he reached to place a bundle into the fire, a sudden movement, a flash of scales, a sharp, searing pain. A viper had latched onto his hand. Gasps erupted from the islanders. They knew this snake. It was venomous, deadly. A single bite often meant certain death. They exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. This man must be cursed, they reasoned. He must have escaped the sea only to meet his judgment on land. Perhaps he was a murderer, and justice would not allow him to live. All eyes were on Paul. The poison would take hold soon. They waited for the swelling, the fever, the collapse. They waited for death, but Paul simply shook the creature off into, the fire. Moments passed, then more. Nothing happened. Paul remained standing, unharmed, unaffected. The islander's eyes widened in disbelief. This was no ordinary man. First he had survived the sea, and now he had defied death itself. Whispers turned to awe, suspicion turned to reverence. Word spread quickly, and soon the most powerful man on the island, Publius, the chief official of Malta, came to meet Paul. He offered hospitality, inviting the apostle and his companions into his home. It was a stark contrast to the shipwreck, to the chaos and suffering they had endured. Now they were being treated not as prisoners, but as guests. And it was here that Paul would witness yet another divine moment. Publius's father lay sick, burning with fever, suffering from dysentery. The household had done all they could, but the illness lingered. When Paul learned of this, he stepped forward with unwavering faith. He placed his hands upon the man and prayed, and in an instant, the fever broke. The sickness vanished. Publius's father sat up, his strength restored, his body healed. The news spread like wildfire. One by one, the sick of the island were brought to Paul, and one by one, they were healed. For 3 months, Paul and his companions remained in Malta, no longer as prisoners but as honored guests. The storm had wrecked their ship, but it had also brought them to a place where miracles would unfold, where faith would grow, where God's power would be made known. The journey was not over. Rome still awaited. But in Malta, amidst the wreckage, amidst the unexpected, God had proven once again that he was in control. The days passed, and what had begun as a disaster slowly turned into something remarkable. Paul and the other survivors had landed in Malta as shipwrecked prisoners, but they were no longer seen as such. The people of the island had opened their arms to them, providing food, shelter, and warmth. What could have been a time of suffering had instead become a season of restoration. Paul, always discerning of God's plan, understood that they had not landed in Malta by chance. It was not a mere accident of wind and waves. The hand of God had guided them here for a purpose, and that purpose was beginning to unfold before his very eyes. Word of Paul's miraculous survival spread rapidly. First, he had survived the storm. Then he had shaken off a deadly viper as if it were nothing. And now the people of Malta had seen him heal the father of Publius, the most powerful man on the island. These were not small events. They were undeniable signs of something greater. One by one, the sick and suffering of Malta came to Paul. Some hobbled in on weak legs, their bodies frail with illness. Others were carried in by family members too weak to walk. The blind, the fevered, the diseased, all gathered with desperate hope in their eyes, and Paul, with the same unwavering faith he had carried across countless trials, prayed over them. He laid his hands upon them. He called upon the power of Jesus Christ, and one by one they were healed. For the people of Malta, this was nothing short of astonishing. They had long believed in their gods, in the spirits of the land and sea, in powers they barely understood. But now, before their very eyes, they saw something greater. They saw the power of the one true God. This once unknown prisoner, this man who had arrived on their shores in chains, was not just a survivor, he was a messenger. And his message was one they could not ignore. As the days stretched into weeks, Paul's presence on the island became more than just that of a guest. He was a teacher, a healer, a bearer of truth. He spoke of Jesus Christ, of salvation, of a love that was greater than the sea that had nearly claimed them all. And the people of Malta listened. It was a divine mission on an unknown island, a mission that no one could have foreseen, but one that had been orchestrated by the hand of God himself. And through it all, Paul never lost sight of his ultimate destination. Rome still awaited. His calling was not yet complete. But here in this unexpected place, he had been given a moment of victory, a moment where suffering turned into purpose, and where an island that had once been a mystery became a place of faith. As Paul continued to minister to the people of Malta, something remarkable began to happen. The island, once an unfamiliar and pagan land to him, was now becoming a place of divine transformation. The sick were healed, the hopeless found faith, and the people who had once viewed him with suspicion now saw him as a man of God. News of the miracles spread rapidly. Those who had witnessed Paul survive the viper's bite now spoke of how he laid hands on the sick and they recovered. The father of Publius, once at death's door, was now strong and well. Families who had suffered for years under the weight of disease now walked in joy and health. These were not mere coincidences. These were acts of God. The Maltese people, who had long worshipped their own gods, began to ask questions. Who was this man? By what power did he heal? What was this name he spoke of? Jesus Christ. They had never heard such a name before, but they could not deny what they were seeing with their own eyes. The power that Paul carried was greater than anything they had ever known. Day after day, Paul taught them. He spoke of Jesus, of the cross, of the resurrection. He told them of God's love, of salvation, of the kingdom of heaven. And though he had come to them as a prisoner, he now stood before them as a messenger of the Most High. The people listened. Their hearts were stirred. They had seen the power of their own gods, but never like this. Their gods had never healed their sick. Their gods had never answered their prayers like this. One by one, they began to believe. They laid down their idols. They turned from their old ways. Families who had lived in darkness now walked in the light of Christ. The island of Malta was changing before Paul's very eyes. It was not just the miracles that transformed them. It was the message of a God who did not remain distant, but who came close. A God who walked among men, who suffered for them, who died and rose again so that they might live. This was unlike anything they had ever known. Paul had set foot on Malta as a shipwrecked prisoner, but now, as his time on the island drew to a close, he knew he was leaving behind something far greater than his own freedom. He was leaving behind a people who had encountered the living God, a people who had been transformed, and as he looked at the faces of those who had once been strangers, but were now brothers and sisters in faith, he knew this was not an accident. This was not a detour. This was the will of God. Malta would never be the same again. As Paul continued his time on Malta, he must have reflected on the strange path that had brought him there. He had been on his way to Rome, the center of the empire, where he was to stand trial before Caesar himself. That had been his destination, the place where he believed God was leading him. And yet here he was, shipwrecked on an island he had never planned to visit, surrounded by people he had never intended to meet. To some, it might have seemed like a delay, a detour, a mistake. But Paul knew better. He had walked with God long, enough to understand that what seemed like a setback was often part of a greater plan. Paul was not in control of his journey, God was. And if God had allowed the storm, the shipwreck, and the delay, then Paul trusted that there was purpose in it. And how could he doubt it now? He had seen it with his own eyes. The people of Malta had experienced healing, salvation, and transformation. An entire island had been touched by the power of Christ. If Paul had never been shipwrecked, would these people have ever heard the gospel? Would they have ever encountered the true and living God? It was a reminder that God's plans are often far bigger than we can see. Paul had been focused on Rome, but God was also focused on Malta. Paul had been looking ahead to his trial, but God had been looking at the hearts of those who needed to be saved. How often do we feel frustrated by delays in our own lives? We set our sights on a goal, we make our plans, and then something happens. A setback, a roadblock, a storm. It can feel like everything is falling apart, like we're stuck in a place we don't belong. But what if that delay is actually divine? What if, in the middle of what feels like a detour, God is doing something greater than we could ever imagine? Paul's time in Malta was not wasted. It was not a mistake. It was a divine appointment. And the same is true in our lives. The delays, the detours, the unexpected twists and turns, they are not accidents. They are opportunities. Opportunities for God to move, to work, to use us in ways we never anticipated. Paul had no idea what awaited him in Rome. He didn't know how his trial would go, or if he would even leave the city alive. But he knew this. God had been faithful in Malta, just as he had been faithful in the storm, and just as he had been faithful through every moment of his journey. So as Paul prepared to leave the island, he wasn't bitter about the time he had spent there. He wasn't frustrated by the delay, because he knew his journey had not been delayed at all. It had been perfectly orchestrated by the hand of God. And the same is true for us. Our delays are not denials. Our detours are not dead ends. When we walk with God, every step, no matter how unexpected, is leading us exactly where we need to be. After months of trials, shipwrecks, and divine encounters, Paul finally set sail once again, this time with Rome in sight. The delay was over. The storms had passed. The journey that had seemed impossible at times was now reaching its intended destination. But when Paul arrived in Rome, he did not enter as a free man. He came in chains, a prisoner of the empire, awaiting trial before Caesar himself. To many, this might have looked like a defeat. After all, Rome was the place where great men stood in power, where rulers dictated the course of history. Paul, on the other hand, was just a man in shackles, accused by his own people, and left to defend himself before the most powerful court in the world. Yet, despite his circumstances, Paul was anything but defeated. In fact, his arrival in Rome was nothing short of a victory, because he wasn't just any prisoner. He was a servant of God, carrying the message of salvation into the heart of the empire. As he was brought into the city, Paul must have looked around at the grandeur of Rome, the towering buildings, the busy streets, the crowds of people from all corners of the world. This was the center of civilization, the place where culture, politics, and military power converged. And now, standing among it all, was a man whose mission was far greater than any earthly kingdom. Though under guard, Paul wasted no time. He immediately called together the Jewish leaders of Rome, explaining his situation and proclaiming the truth of Christ. Some listened with open hearts, while others rejected the message. But Paul did not waver. Day after day, he preached, taught, and encouraged those who would listen. And soon something remarkable happened. The gospel began to spread. Even in chains, Paul was unstoppable. His imprisonment did not silence him. If anything, it amplified his voice. Guards who were assigned to watch over him heard the message of salvation. Visitors who came to see him carried the truth to others. Letters written from his confinement would go on to shape the course of Christianity for generations to come. Paul's journey had not been easy. He had faced storms, betrayals, persecution and imprisonment, and yet through it all he had remained faithful, because he understood something that many struggle to grasp. God's plans are not limited by human obstacles. The chains on Paul's wrists did not stop God's word from going forth. The walls of his confinement could not contain the power of the gospel, and that same truth remains for us today. There will be moments in life when we feel bound by circumstances, by opposition, by struggles we didn't anticipate. But just as Paul's mission continued despite his chains, our purpose in Christ is never hindered by earthly setbacks. Paul's time in Rome was not marked by despair. It was marked by victory. He preached the gospel boldly. He wrote letters that would strengthen believers for centuries. And most of all, he showed the world that true freedom is not found in the absence of chains, but in the presence of Christ. And so, as Paul's journey came to an end, he could look back and see that every storm, every trial, and every unexpected turn had led him exactly where he needed to be. Rome had been his destination, but his true calling was never about a place. It was about a mission to proclaim the name of Jesus, no matter the cost. And that mission continues with us. Like Paul, we are called to stand firm, to speak truth, and to trust that even when our path is uncertain, God is always leading us exactly where we need to go.